pest risk analysis only uses the word pests. It never refers to disease. So you always have to put the footnote that pest risk analysis includes disease. And sometimes that does sort of create confusion because people associate pests as insects and they think that's all that you're talking to. When I look at emerging pests and diseases, my focus is still probably in Africa, and I still think some of the biggest diseases risks around cassava diseases, things that I'm familiar with. It's curious that brown streak is still limited to East Africa. Same for banana wilt, yet cassava and banana are big crops in West Africa. Maize lethal necrosis also, maize is a massive crop in Nigeria, but maize lethal necrosis isn't in Nigeria. So why these things aren't spreading to the extent they could do in Africa is a puzzle. So I think those are still existing and significant threats. Africa needs to do better is to list what it feels are its major risks. And then the other side of this is what you think is when you say that these are the most significant threats. So is that a threat to your food security or to economic price?
Hi, welcome once again to another episode of the Next Gen Agro Talks podcast, and your humble self, your co-host, Oladapo Folani. With me is my regular.
Hey, welcome everyone. Okelola Folani, the two Folanis again. Welcome.
And here today we've got a big fish. I call him a big fish, and we're privileged to have him as our guest. I would allow him to introduce himself. We have with us Dr. Julian Smith. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. So firstly, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to be a talker on the Next Gen Agro Talk podcast and to meet my colleagues Olapo and Florin from times back in when we were doing projects in Nigeria on cassava. My name is Julian Smith. I'm the science director here at Rothamsted Research in the UK, overseeing protecting crops and the environment. Rothamsted is one of the leading research institutes in the UK with a very long history.
Thank you, Dr. Julian. Without further ado, I think we carry on with the for you today, and hopefully we won't take too much of your time. So I'm just curious, what initially drew you into your present career, and what is that section of science, strategy and policy within the agriculture space?
At the beginning of my career, from foremost, and the things that sort of guided it is a real interest in plants and culture, and so a genuine concern for how plants grow and plant diseases and environmental sustainability. I did a degree in agricultural botany in Aberystwyth here in the UK. That's in Wales on the coast, and also then did a PhD. My PhD was on soil microbiology and looking at rhizobium. And at that time, I probably thought I would get a job at an institute like Rothamsted, which is primarily concerned with UK agriculture. But what happened was my first was at CABI, CAB International, which is totally sort of a bespoke international organization looking at international development. So for the first 15 years of my career, I spent working in East Africa, based in the UK, but working on projects in East Africa, Bolivia, Pakistan, Asia, addressing a multitude of plant pathology, fungal diseases, bacterial diseases, etc. So that's where I started. And what happened when I was at Rothamsted at CABI was we did identification services for international development. So countries would send us samples, and I received a banana sample from Uganda. This is back in something like 2002, I'm going to say. And I did the identification for that sample, and that was the first identification of what was bacterial wilt in Uganda, which was a massive disease, spread across all of East Africa very quickly. Having been isolated in Ethiopia for the 1960s, this was the first introduction into Uganda. And I remember working with the Ministry of Agriculture in Uganda, concerned about the risk that this disease might pose, and it was just very difficult to get that message communicated effectively across within Uganda and across nations that this was a major concern, until it was a major concern and then spread throughout. So this is the intersection policy and strategy that, as by the question, because I realized then that one of the main differences between the UK and what I understood in the UK as our prioritization of effort in terms of plant health and in Africa was the UK is really good at worrying about stuff so that it doesn't happen. We do pest risk analysis really thoroughly. And there was an absence of that in Africa that I saw. So the responsiveness wasn't there. Donors weren't interested in preventing something from happening. Keen to be involved in something when it had happened. There was lots to do around it. But the idea of prevention or the culture of prevention in East Africa and Africa generally was very weak. So that was a key turning point in my career. And off the back of that, and for family reasons, I was quite keen to live somewhere else in the UK outside of London, which was very busy. I took up a job at FERA. So it was always a mix of science and family and stuff. So you make choices. FERA is an agency of the UK government who preside over plant health in the UK. They are the National Plant Protection Organisation. And in that organisation, I sat amongst people doing pest risk analysis who were doing the job that I was interested in. Making sure that UK as an island, we have a very strong sense of biosecurity, and it was just a good place to be. And at FERA, I then got involved in cassava brown streak spread, lethal necrosis. We did a lot of projects in East Africa looking at preventing diseases from spreading and driving that risk culture. So I undertook some of the first pest risk analysis for Africa that were ever done. And I think that was fairly significant. So that's really what I think is my career sort of path. And then how am I here at Rothamsted? Well, that's just an end of career sort of happening. Associated with COVID, I took on a secondment into the UK government of Go Science, and then I just didn't return to FERA in a sense. I took up a role here. That's just how paths happen. But here, very interested in maintaining the links in international agriculture for Rothamsted, but less now perhaps on the risk side, but more on just the research side.
Yeah, very interesting. Navigating through, a lifetime career in plant protection, and interesting story. Dream come true eventually in Rothamsted.
Yeah.
You thought of Rothamsted from the beginning, and now fate has brought you to Rothamsted.
Yes.
So my own question will look at your extensive experience. So how would you describe the most significant shift you've witnessed in UK and international agri production, food safety and environmental sustainability over the world?
It's a difficult question. And I think one of the things because change happens quite slowly, but I guess over time, the thing that's really changed in agriculture is driven by the supply chains and the supermarkets, and how markets dictate the farming practices and the connectivity between practices. So these days, if I go to a supermarket and if I can't buy a kiwi fruit or an avocado or asparagus at any point in time, it's like something strange is happening. Couple of years back, tomatoes, there was a tomato shortage because of weather in Morocco, and supply chains are really good at compensating for supply chain shocks, so they can access tomatoes from other areas. Asparagus comes from Peru a lot, but if it doesn't come from Peru, it comes from Morocco or other countries, etc. And as a consumer, I'm pretty seamless as to whether my food is coming to. But underneath all that, I think there's immense change in agriculture as to the practices and the power shift between the producer and the farmer, and there's migrated towards the supermarket chain stakeholders that drive efficiency and price. That's the flexibility that supply chains have, I think, is awesome, but it's not to the advantage of farmers who are slightly disempowered. So the consequences of that is that we talk about buying food, local food, but actually it's very difficult to buy local food and because you want that choice and you get better price by the supply chains. And the supermarkets, so whilst they talk about sustainability, their primary focus is providing a low price. If you look at all the supermarkets in the UK currently, they're always trying to match the bottom value. There's a race to the bottom on price. Tesco's will say their prices are matched to Aldi or Lidl in price matching. That's a race to the bottom. And there's no no sense that sustainability or a cost on environmental sustainability can be supported by supermarkets whilst that sort of narrative is progressing. So in terms of how agriculture has changed, I think that's a really big factor. Because under all of that is things around intensification of farming systems or extensification of farming systems. And governments want to do one thing. They want to build in, if I look to the UK, they want to build in sustainability, looking to build in these SFIs for farms so that they can be rewarded for biodiversity. But there's no price for environmental sustainability at the supermarket. So it's a rather strange situation at the moment as to what we want from our land.
Interesting. So a second question from me, it's looking at global agricultural landscape, what do you see as the single most pressing challenge we face today and why?
So it is building off that last question. Back in, I'm going to say 2010, the UK did a very large project on foresight farming futures led by Go Science. And the great and the good brought this project together about environmental sustainability. And at that time, I asked the question, 10 years on, if I go into the supermarket, and 10 years on is now past that point, would the price in the supermarket be dictated by market powers of cost efficiency, or would there be an environmental tax on food? And if sustainability was to be achieved, and at that time, the people that had authored that report said that the markets would come together and they would factor in sustainability into the price. I don't think they have. And I think this is the biggest challenge that now faces global food security, is how we build in those values that aren't just driven by productivity and yield. And we need to find some other economic values by which farmers or the supply chain supports environmental outcomes that are ultimately monetary but not yield or quality. So maybe this is around carbon crediting or biodiversity sort of metrics, but these are all very difficult things to value, very difficult things for the commercial sector to put a price to. So they want to reduce pesticide use, but because regulations are tightening up on pesticide use, so they're trying to find natural alternatives to pesticides, but these are difficult to find and difficult to put on a shelf. I mean, trying to encourage natural enemies in a farm system isn't something that industry can make as a product very easily. So I think these are where some of the difficulties lie, is how we sort of create these landscapes that are sustainable, because ultimately each farm is a unit in itself, and whilst the landscape has to be sustainable and we can look at it at that scale, and governments might look at it at that scale, farmers will only look at it as to their own interests, and they have to be profitable, and they're not going to do stuff that isn't profitable, because they can't, and that's the bottom line. The bottom line does drive farmer practices and landscapes, and I think that we have to sort of address those issues, and it's not an easy area to that. So there's things around social governance, environmental and social governance, which is an interesting sort of concept where industries sort of start to talk about how they're showing their values against environments and society and sustainability. But currently, I think these haven't yet matured into ways in which actually are helping the world move in that direction.
Great, thank you very much. So, as a plant protection expert, how would you be able to explain the difference between pest and disease in the plant health context? And why do you think the distinction matters when we're carrying out risk analysis?
So this is, I'm going to take this a slightly different way, because pests and diseases, pests relate to insects generally, and diseases to pathogens. And then you also have viruses, which are diseases. Nematodes cause disease. FAO has a definition that encompasses all of those things, and it's pests. So they never talk, or pests, FAO language, their definition of pests includes insects, viruses, pathogens, nematodes. Anything that is injurious to a plant is defined as a pest, and including what GMOs, but they don't call them GMOs, they call them LMOs, living modified organisms, in the sense that they might cause a pest. So pest risk analysis only uses the word pests. It never refers to disease. So you always have to put the footnote that pest risk analysis includes disease. And sometimes that does sort of create confusion because people associate pests as insects and they think that's all that you're talking to. So I think that's the qualification of that sentence, question I'd give, is that pest risk analysis is encompassing of anything that's injurious to plants.
I'll reframe my question because of your, education about, pests and diseases. Of course, that pest also covers diseases in FAO definition. So what emerging plant pests are currently on your radar that you believe pose the most significant threat to global food security?
Wow. Okay. So one thing I've been talking about pest risk analysis and emerging pests for quite a lot of years now in the context of African systems, probably back from 2005, really got involved in this area. One of the things I've always wanted to make clear in presentations is that diseases and pests are not necessarily a bad thing. They're not, if an everyday pest, one that we know about, one that farmers control well, creates market value. It differentiates that farmer from another farmer that doesn't manage that pest well. So if you think of the common pests and pathogens that we encounter and farmers are familiar with, then they control them well and they can manage them and they can create a good yield. And the farmer next door that doesn't do so doesn't create the yield, doesn't get the quality, and that's why you get good and poor farmers. The thing about emerging pests or new pests is that they come in, just to go back a step, those good farmers are also investing in infrastructure, putting on fertilizer and pesticides and so they're investing in their systems, whereas perhaps the poorer practice farmers aren't doing that. So then if you get a new disease come in or a new pest, which a farmer is not familiar with, what happens is that all those practices that he or she is doing are made redundant because they're not expected and they lose their crop. But worse than that, they've invested in that crop, so they are vulnerable for that investment. So that's why new diseases or emerging pests, things that we're not prepared for, shock the system, are much worse than everyday pests. Whereas the farmer who's not invested in these things so much hasn't exposed themselves to that financial risk. They get impacted in the same way as the better farmers, but not to the same outcome of yield of financial loss. So when I look at emerging pests and diseases, my focus is still probably in Africa, and I still think some of the biggest diseases risks around cassava diseases, things that I'm familiar with. It's curious that brown streak is still limited to East Africa. Same for banana wilt, yet cassava and banana are big crops in West Africa. Maize lethal necrosis also, maize is a massive crop in Nigeria, but maize lethal necrosis isn't in Nigeria. So why these things aren't spreading to the extent they could do in Africa is a puzzle. So I think those are still existing and significant threats. There is talk about Fusarium tropical race 4 as a big threat to banana. And I'm not swayed by that one for Africa because the pathogenicity of that pathogen is limited to Cavendish banana and less so the other types of banana that are commonplace in Africa. So I think that's slightly overrated as a risk to Africa. Fall armyworm came and went through and is still a big problem. But now we're probably getting on top of that and managing it to some extent. It's hard to know really, because just as in politics, diseases have their moment of fame, and when the media gets tired of reporting on them, you don't know if they've gone away or not. But there's other diseases from Asia that could come into Africa on cassava, and I think those are the things that we need to look at. What Africa needs to do better is to list what it feels are its major risks, and then the other side of this is what you think is when you say that these are the most significant threats. So is that a threat to your food security or to economic price? So there's some pests and diseases enter into, if we look at things like pepper and chili in East Africa, so not massive food security crops, but there's a few diseases there which have significantly limited the export potential of those crops to Europe, and that has massive economic value. So there's food security value and then there's economic value. So it depends on the criteria that you're sort of layering into that question. So those things that you export and those things that you see as food security are very different. So banana, cassava, food security crop, that catches lots of headlines. But if you lose your citrus industry because of a disease, then you can't export oranges, or if you lose some sort of your vegetable commodities, then that's going to be a major impact to Africa. And same for the UK. If we can't export things, that would make a big difference to some of the things that we grow. Just because of the incurrence of a pest. Food security isn't an issue for the UK because the supply chains will always compensate. It's more about economic value for us, I think.
Thank you very much, Dr. Julian. So talking about new plant pests and diseases, from your experience, what would you say is involved in developing contingency plan when we have new plant pests and diseases, and what are the key steps that are always taken, and what unique challenges do you encounter in this process?
So pest risk analysis and contingency planning is a well-drafted formal practice, and it starts off with the pest risk analysis itself, where you first identify what the pest is, and then pest, I'm using the broad definition here, the FAO definition, and show that you can identify it as a species or a taxonomic entity, so it's something that you can define. And then you go through this process as to whether you have it in your country and prove that you don't have it in this country. So pest risk analysis is always to do with showing, putting in place a regulation. So it's not to do with just an everyday pest. It has to be to do with that you demonstrating that you don't have this pathogen or this pest in your country, or it's of limited distribution. And if it fits those two criteria, then you can start to place regulations around it. If it's everywhere and common, then it's hard to put a regulation around it. So you look at the pest lists and you say, well, this is a significant pest. It's not in our country, or it's of limited distribution in our country, but it is in that country over there. So we want to know what the risks of that pest coming to our country are. And that's your entry pathways. And then you look at, so that could be association in trade, on people's, in passenger airways, it could be on the outside of aircraft or aircraft transits, all sorts of things bring pests and pathogens. Seed industry is a big factor in spreading disease, so certification of seeds, as we've seen. So you look at those pathways, and some are quite obvious, but others are less obvious. A lot of wood diseases come in associated with crates and timber that aren't to do with the commodity that you think you might be looking at, but they're just associated with the trade. But they are also a risk. So that you do those pathway analysis and you come up with what you think are the main pathways. And then you go through another process, which is that's entry done, so establishment and spread. Will that pathogen have the opportunity to offload from the entry point, wherever that is, onto a host and replicate and establish? If you can see that as happening, then you tick two of the boxes. And then you look at how it might spread. So where's the next nearest host? So you have to build up all this whole picture of epidemiology and host, right? So until you get to the idea of what the future economic consequences are and what the management strategies are. And then you work out if this is something that's going to create a big impact or not, and whether it's justified to put management measures in place that are to regulate the movement or the imports of this commodity to your country. Maybe it's the case that existing practices will control this disease and it's not such a big deal. Otherwise, it might be a significant deal. So contingency is all around how you prepare yourself for. Once you've identified this as a pest of risk and you want to put in measures, then the contingency is all a little bit around how you put in the inspections facilities at the ports of entry, and then work with your overseas partner to make sure that they're limiting the risk at source. If you can control it at source, I think that's the primary. That's the best thing to do. But then equally, once you have the inspection capabilities at portside, and then also you look at where the first outbreak might happen and what you would do if you got that outbreak. So surveillance and monitoring of high risk entry sites. So in the UK, we tend to look at landscapes and we find out where the hosts are, such that we can sort of create and layer into that where trade is or where people are, or whatever the risk factors are, such we can say that this area, because of these factors, if this pest is to enter, it's most likely could happen here. So we'll monitor that area, not that area, because we think that's a low risk area. So you could put in these practices just to have an early warning of it coming in, and then you have to have a plan as to what you do, because you have a very finite opportunity to control it, to manage it. So, eradication, you have the powers to go in and uproot a crop. If it's a greenhouse, you can quarantine the greenhouse. You can put in these places, and in countries like the UK, where there's a strong legal basis for doing those things, it can happen. We've got various measures in place now for various avian flu on poultry. In Uganda, when I was looking at banana xanthomonas wilt, it was very difficult to put those sort of measures in place because of the systems there, but because it already spread. But I think the opportunity had been lost at that time. But that's what, so contingency is about that planning. I mean, there's some big diseases out there that happen. We had a major outbreak of Xylella on olives in Italy. In Morocco, Northern Africa, there's significant olive production and citrus production, and Xylella is the number one pest risk for the UK on oak, not agricultural crops, but on environmental systems. The risk to North Africa for that is probably large, but undocumented to some extent. So there should be practices in place there to sort of monitor for if it's present and if it's causing damage and where it is. And we have had workshops that did that when the outbreaks on olive first happened. But trying to get parity of effort between Europe and Africa is not easy. Put it that way. There were millions put into European research on controlling Xylella in Europe, and far less in Africa. Even though, bizarrely, I know the olive cuttings were going from Italy to Morocco, which must have been a risk. And equally, they go to other places. It is, so it's that awareness of stuff which still is disappointing that it's not better.